Hi, welcome to Wetpixel Live. I'm Adam Hanlon, I'm the editor of Wetpixel, and we'd like to thank Solaya Beach Resort in the Philippines, in Dumaguete in the Philippines, for sponsoring this episode. Solaya at Dumaguete, black sand destination, full of amazing macro critters, together with some wonderful wide-angle diving offshore. So I'm super happy to be joined by Alex Mustard. Hi, Alex.
Hi, Adam. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. And so in other episodes of Wetpixel Live, we've often emphasized the fact that one of the key rules behind taking great underwater images is to get close. And it's been highlighted that actually with some marine creatures, getting close can be a challenge. So I thought I'd ask Alex, how does he get close to stuff that he's taking pictures of?
Well, I think it's actually a really important part of being a successful underwater photographer. But I'll start with some of the good news about it. And that's, first of all, that the majority of creatures that we see in the ocean or in the underwater world are not naturally scared of us. They don't see the human body, the human shape as something that they need to be, to be running away from. And I think that's a massive advantage that we have over nature photographers on land, where the majority of the wildlife that they shoot runs away at the sight of a person.
Yeah,
for
that's a
very
good point.
The underwater life hasn't learned how dangerous we are, thankfully for us, not as individuals, but certainly collectively. That said, I think it's still really important we get all the details right in our approach, because otherwise we can really blow a really great photographic opportunity by assuming that we can just swim straight up to everything underwater and get a picture. And if we make our approach correctly, not only will we end up closer at the end of it, we will also end up with a subject that's very relaxed, and that's what tends to give you those special shots. So absolutely critical in this is actually being a really good scuba diver. And anytime anyone who's sort of a dive professional, a dive master, an instructor, who tells me they want to get into underwater photography, I know that they're going to get off to such a good start because they've got those diving skills absolutely nailed down. And so, I know it sounds a silly thing, but actually the more you dive and the more you finesse those skills, the better you will be around marine life, the more accepting that marine life will be. And I think that the better your pictures will come. And that comes from obviously having that buoyancy nailed down. And we've talked a lot in the past about how that is, about having that trim right, so you're not constantly having to adjust yourself because you're floating or sinking in a way that you don't want. And then being that slow, relaxed diver with slow movements, in control of yourself, not flapping about the place, not making unnecessary movements with your body, which are going to create those vibrations, that movement in the water that animals are going to react to. And obviously any sort of waving around, flapping, backing up, all these things are going to stress out animals in that space.
Animals are very, very, all animals are very, very aware of sudden movement. Gradual, slow movement, they will often ignore, or it may even attract their attention positively. But the moment you start moving rapidly, they're seeing that as a potential threat, because obviously that's the behavior of predators. They'll get close and then they'll dive in and predate. So in general, avoiding any kind of sudden movement will always help pay dividends when you're trying to interact with marine species.
Yeah, absolutely. It's often said that all animals have this kind of circle of trust, this personal space that they don't want invaded. But that circle of trust is not a fixed size.
No.
And if you are stressing and you are, aggravating the world as you move about, the circle of trust of all animals expands out, and their personal space expands out, and they don't want anyone coming in anywhere closer than that. Whereas if you are at one with that environment, those circles of personal space shrink down, and animals are much happier with you making a closer approach. The next factor that again doesn't affect photographers on land but very much affects us underwater is breathing. When we breathe out on open circuit in diving gear underwater, we create a plume of bubbles, but that plume of bubbles is very noisy. And particularly if you start that breath with a big that's a big noise, a big explosion of very fast movement underwater that can stress an animal out. So underwater photographers have learned to be smooth with that breathing, particularly the start of the breath. if you're trying to get close to an animal, I often go brrr, and just start the breath slightly slower. It's to say, if you run up to someone and shove them, they move away. Whereas if you start pushing them slowly and increase the power to the same strength as shove, they will resist much better. And it's, you don't create that shock reaction with a smooth movement when you bring the pressure on smoothly. So smooth breathing is really important. There were definitely times underwater where, one of the golden rules of scuba diving is don't hold your breath. But there is definitely times underwater where as an underwater photographer, I would never, of course, hold my breath as an underwater photographer. All I do is I slow my breathing down to a point that no air is coming out. So I'm still breathing, there's just no air coming out. So I wouldn't hold my breath, of course, underwater.
Just breathe very, very slowly.
Definitely not breathing at critical moments or breathing out at critical moments. You're still in that, just extending that pause between breathing in and breathing out will make a big difference when maneuvering close around subject.
This is something that, again, dials back into those diving skills. And possibly, I would imagine Alex probably does it without realizing, but it's something you can think about, is that if you're slightly under buoyant, by that I mean you're wearing slightly too much weight, or possibly you haven't added sufficient air to your BCD or buoyancy system, then what happens is, in order to maintain neutral buoyancy, you have to use a greater lung volume. So therefore you're producing more bubbles. Whereas if you're the other way, so i.e. slightly positively buoyant, you can breathe off the top of your lungs and do much smaller breaths. So in actual fact, getting your buoyancy set up, and this is something you want to do before you're coming close to the subject, will allow you, so you can literally be doing much smaller breaths and producing less bubbles. And this is something, once you're dialed into it, you can consciously do. Now, I would imagine a lot of...
I've never thought about it, but the sums make sense.
A lot.
And obviously, we've talked a lot about how much both of us really value getting that buoyancy right. It's not something just to take for granted. And, we talked about dropping weight as trips go on, and you don't need less weight. And I guess I never really realized it was a virtuous circle that, by diving more neutrally, you're more in control of yourself, but you also making less impact with those noisy breaths.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And you can adjust that. You can be aware of it. But a lot of people do it probably unwittingly. But it's worth thinking about. If you're finding you're doing big breaths underwater, add a little bit of air into wherever you add air to, and you may well find then you can achieve the same effect, but by using less volume of air to do so. So which reduces your bubbles.
Next up is kind of our reaction. Usually we spot a subject some distance off, and we need to close that ground down to them to get to them. And there's a few things that we can do that will minimize, will increase our chances of getting in close. So the first thing is don't swim straight at a subject. If you see something great and you line up straight on it and start kicking your fins as at a reasonable lick, you're going to create a bow wave. You're going to create this feeling of, oh my god, there's that big thing coming straight towards me with arms and two big eyes out here, and racing in towards it. And I think that's something we want to avoid with the subject. And a technique that's often used is to work your way closer to the subject by predominantly swimming parallel to it, and slowly closing down that distance by slowly working your way, swimming in the same direction of it, because ultimately you want to end up in front of it. So so you need to swim in the same direction it's moving and just slowly work your way towards it. And turtles are a great subject to practice this on. You you want to suddenly just be up next to them without them realizing you've closed the distance. Because typically what they don't like, what a lot of marine life don't like, is you swimming at them, but actually they're quite happy about you being around them as long as they didn't get spooked by you closing that distance along the way. Other things you can do when you're doing that is staying relatively low. A lot of dive sites have topography. If you keep the subject always, that you can see it, it can always see you. Whereas if you know it's moving that way, ducking down amongst the topography and staying out of sight as you close the distance down can make a really big difference with really easily spooked subjects, say like an eagle ray coming over a reef. Sometimes letting it do the movement, lining yourself up in its path and staying low, maybe keeping the amount of bubbles coming out to a minimum and allowing it to close the ground towards you will reward you with a much closer path than you trying to get to it.
There's something you alluded to earlier as well. Is the fact that you create a pressure wave as you move, and marine creatures are very sensitive to pressure changes. So there's no doubt, if you're still, or moving very slowly, you reduce the amount of water you're moving around you, and that certainly reduces your footprint, if you like, in the water. Yeah, sure. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, and a final small point in all of that is I do think with all animals, they don't like being stared at.
Yeah.
And it's a relatively minor point, but I do think if you're trying to close down the distance between you and a subject, actually looking at it the whole way in is not the way to do it. I tend to, angle my mask so I can just see out at the side of it. And so, but I'm clearly not looking at the subject, and I'm just glancing across, keeping an eye on it as I slowly meander my way across to it. I'm just moseying along in this sort of direction. I'm not looking at you at all. And then suddenly you're up close, and they're very, very different. Definitely that for me is a major point, that it's the process of being close to an animal doesn't tend to stress it out. The process of moving towards it does. Yeah. And so that's the bit you want to be sensitive to. And, as you shoot more and more underwater, you basically learn these lessons the hard way. You learn what does work and what doesn't work. And I think a lot of us just absorb this way of behavior underwater naturally into us because we found it successful. And you develop a way of maneuvering up to and around creatures.
Once you're in close to a subject, a lot of subjects are actually quite curious, and they're quite happy to hang around and in many ways seem as interested in what we're doing as what they're doing, as long as we, all the provisos apply, that we're moving slowly and gradually. And one tip that I've seen you used and I've copied now is sometimes what I will do is I've got my hands on the handles of my housings and I'll just wriggle my finger at it. So just to, and that sometimes that's that little movement. It's a small movement. I'm not waving my hands around, but it's a small movement. It's just enough. Again, they look at that and they go, "Oh, what's that?" And that I think is quite an interesting thing to try and do. So actually engaging with them. Wouldn't say I'm trying to communicate with them, but engaging, give them something to look at, give them something to focus on to attract their interest, can actually sometimes get results. Doesn't work every time, but occasionally, if you've got a particularly fish that's kind of quite interested in what you're up to, that can be quite a useful thing. And I know that people, for example, with seals or marine mammals will tie ribbons and things to their strobe arms and things. And again, these are often things that obviously they are very interactive creatures anyway. But again, these are the kinds of things that will attract the animal's attention, will pull it in and allow you to get in close to get good pictures. So yeah, I mean, engaging them to some extent it can be another tool to do so.
Yeah, I on one of the sea lion trips I did, it's not a case of they're going to come and interact with you with those types of subjects, but what you want is you to be the person out of all the divers in the water that they want to interact with the most. And I would say with seals, what I say on the sea lion trips to people is stay still. They go to the dive guides because the dive guides are super chilled out in the water. Stay as still as you can, and they'll feel comfortable coming close to you. If you are doing this all the time, they're going to go, I don't want to get into that space. Whereas if you can stay still, they'll come towards you. On the sea lion trips, I used to get a loop of pink neoprene and just loop it through the little hook on the hood, top of my hood. And I had this piece of and they loved it because it would just like waggle around above my head, and they were just so curious. But I'd always end up with a sea lion on my head. Anyway, we talk about the finger waggling stuff, or sometimes people, if they've got a ring, they'll tap that on the housing, just make a little noise. That works really well when you are stayed stationary.
Yes, true.
I have seen, we've talked about these on workshops, and then I'll see someone on a dive completely kind of all over the place, and then trying to waggle their finger at the same time. See the finger waggling because they're moving. It only works when you are completely still, the animal is super chilled out with you, and you just want to maybe pique the curiosity to get a bit of extra eye contact with a seahorse or a little goby, just to swing its, instead of its eyes being out to the side, it just swings them forward, and you get that little bit of eye contact. And I think it's not, it's for that subtle thing, not for, oh, the animal's running away from me, wiggling my finger around as I do this. It's going to make it turn back towards me. And I think, you get that right. I think subject selection is also a really important part of getting close. And obviously there are certain species that are much easier to approach than others. But even within a species, there's a variation on an individual level. And there's no doubt, I love doing fish photography on training dive sites where where the individuals that live on that site are really used to divers because they see people there all the time, and it's a great place to do that type of photography. So I'd really, so going to the right dive sites can make a big difference. And then within any community, within any population of a species, you will find individuals that just seem, maybe just for that day or maybe just generally, they're more easily approached. And whenever you get one of those supermodel subjects, a particularly friendly lionfish, a particularly friendly grouper, you want to make sure that you use that as your opportunity to get your best ever grouper shots, your best ever lionfish shots. So whenever you get that supermodel subject, make the most. Even if you went in the water going, oh, I want to shoot something else this dive. When you get those supermodel individuals, that's the time when you can really nail that perfect shot of that subject.
And definitely time to change your plan, isn't it? Maximize opportunities when you have them. Absolutely, it's well put. I
think as well, behavior can play a role in that. Particularly, I would say, particularly around mating. When you've got fish guarding eggs, you've got fish spawning, wanting to show off. Not only are they in their best colors, but they're also often more approachable. So when subjects are distracted by what they're doing, if you can approach them in a way that keeps their natural behavior intact, you're more likely to be able to get, up close in their face and get those shots.
And I think that ties in probably, the more you know about the species, I mean, we're not all going to be marine biologists, it's not going to happen, but the more you know about an individual species, the better you're probably able to maximize those chances as well. If you know that a particular fish is spawning in a particular area at a certain time of year, and you know that they're more relaxed around spawning times, or they're distracted perhaps during spawning times, then that's the time to go there, surely. So there's no point in turning up a dive destination and finding that actually the species that you wanted to shoot is not around or whatever. So I mean, a little bit of research, a little bit of time spent figuring out so you can maximize your opportunities. Absolutely.
And then the final factor in all of this is often talked about anytime about watching wildlife is patience. And what I wrote in my book about this is, I think if you think that you need patience to get these shots, you're going about it wrong. The way you get great pictures of marine life is that you love spending time in their company, and it requires no patience at all to wait for your shot, because you are having the best time ever watching those animals, waiting for those moments. It's exciting all the way through the process. It's engaging all the way through. So yes, patience is important, but if you feel you're having to be patient waiting for the shot, then maybe this type of photography, that type of subject isn't right for you. And maybe you need to go and find a subject that you will happily spend your days waiting for the nudibranch to lift its head and show its rhinophores or whatever, because actually that's the right subject for you to be shooting. And I don't believe that patience is the key. Yes, you need to be patient in the approach, and I'm being slightly flippant in my answer, but I think it's really valuable to actually find things that you're passionate about, that you will happily invest this time in, so that you make all these approaches in the right way.
I think you're right. I mean, I think if you're not a bit of a fish watcher or a fish spotter, it will limit your ability to approach, get close, really. Absolutely. Thank you, Alex. Lots of wonderful advice there. You mentioned your book. Where can we get it?
Underwater Photography Masterclass is the name of my book on underwater photography. I know many people who watch this are very familiar with it. Probably know it much better than I do, because actually when I wrote it, I obviously read every single bit of it many, many times, but I actually don't read it these days. But yeah, it's well worth checking out if you're interested in underwater photography.
A little bit of trivia. What language is it published in?
Well, it's an English book. I know individual photographers have translated it into most languages, and there's versions around on the internet that you can find. But officially, it's in Chinese and Korean as well.
So there we go. So excellent. Thank you very much, Alex. We'd like to thank Salaya Beach Resort again for sponsoring this episode. We really appreciate the support. Please feel free to drop us a like, to ring the notification bell, which will inform you when we release our next episode, or drop us a like if you enjoyed it. Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you again soon.